One of the very best looking EMD demonstrators, in my opinion, was the GP20. I first saw it on the front cover of the Model Railroader December 2002 issue as part of their Jeep history, where they collected over 50 different models to represent about 50 years worth of GP units. And just recently, I finally got the chance to get my hands on a Proto 2000 GP20 in the demonstrator paint scheme in mint condition. So for this video, I will be doing a review of this model. For just about the first 20 years of production, Proto 2000 models came in a large box like this with a photo of the prototype on the front, as well as large print and some features on the front. Metallic logos, which was kind of nice, NMRA there. Limited edition, which I would say is not completely the case with this, considering that this model is still being reproduced occasionally today by Walthers with the same shell and everything, just about. Around the back you'll find some prototype info, measurements, and just a couple other details here and there. The really interesting thing about these early models is that in order to prevent damage, they would separate the shell from the chassis for the buyer to assemble when they unpacked it. By doing this, they managed to protect the detail on the shell very well. Pretty much all the details are made of plastic, so they are fragile. And another nice thing about this, I've always thought, is that when you pick one of these up, you see exactly what you're getting. The inside of the chassis, motor, flywheels, some of the electronics, and just weight and other things. I always thought that this was just a really cool way of doing it. They just really show off what it is you're getting. And then on that inner flap, you get a few other features, such as the details and some of the mechanical features and other parts. Now, unpacking this from the box. Comes in a nice large styrofoam tray with 3 chambers, one for the shell, one for the chassis, and then another area just for extra parts such as details, which are prototype specific, although they always include the full set of details with every model regardless of prototype, so you can put them on to match the real ones, or you can mix and match parts a little bit to your liking. This is taped close, so I just need to get a knife to open that up. Just a quick trim through there. Now I can open that up. First thing I'll pull out is the shell. Being very gentle. Goes. There we go. So there's the shell. It's on its own little styrofoam block, which helps keep it in place. Lift that right off. And there it is, all in nice, perfect condition. It's never been touched before since it came out of the factory. That really is just That really is a cool looking paint scheme. I've always liked that one ever since I first saw it. Now, pulling out the chassis, which is on a couple little plastic end pieces here to help keep it centered and in place. So you can see here it has this giant weight that runs through practically the entire thing. The only thing they don't fill is the cab. And there's just a little room up here for a constant lighting board that has a light bulb here, reverse light here. You can see that's all screwed together, so nice and sturdy. And then underneath, and you can see that this has the Athearn clone trucks. And these are prone to getting split axle gears, so I'm going to check on that before I ever run this one. It also has the Athearn clone motor, which was an almost exact copy of the gold motors made by Athearn. Just about the only difference is that this uses a 2.4mm shaft instead of an 1/8" shaft. It's got flywheels on it. You can see in there just the universals. And only one wire coming from each truck. The other rail is grounded to the frame, I believe, and has a wire connected somewhere, but we'll see more of that in a little bit. And then in the third chamber, there's the bag of details. So you get some horn hook couplers, some footboards for the pilots, winterization hatch, and a few other odds and ends. So that's a pretty nice set they give you. And this here is a hook for opening the doors on the cab. This is another feature that I really liked about the early Proto 2000 models. I'll get to showing that later once I open that bag, but you can open these doors, this one here, and then this one over here. They don't do that anymore, even though they still use the same tooling. I assume that they either just added that into the mold or they glue it on at the factory, but yeah, on these old Proto 2000s, they just really went the extra mile to put everything they could think of in there. I just really liked their style back then. See-through radiator vents on top with the fans inside. And then of course you can see all the other little details all around, like the finely molded chain, these plastic grills over the additional ventilation detail inside. So that looks really nice. And then of course inside the box is all the paperwork and other documentation. Removal instructions. I could have read that before I took it out, but I've handled this before, so oh well. And an additional main instruction manual with the exploded diagrams of a couple different versions, depending on the prototype modeled. Then just some other instruction on cleaning, lubrication, placing the light bulbs. Then a parts list. The next thing, of course, is assembly, but before I do that, this chassis has been sitting in its box for at least 20 years, so I'm going to take this over to the workbench first and give this a good cleaning and tune-up, because any oil and grease that's in there is more than likely dried up or even hardened. Alright, so I've got the chassis here on the workbench, and the first thing you can see on top, of course, is the constant lighting, directional lighting circuit. So this works using a whole bunch of diodes that work in series. It looks like with these resistors. A lot of times the constant lighting circuits just have the diodes working in series with the motor, so there's a voltage drop of about usually 2.1 volts on the motor before it actually starts to get voltage to run. Anyway, getting inside of here, just a couple screws to take off. That releases the board. Then of course there are the wires from the motor, which will be the next ones to come off, I think. Yep, there that goes. And let's see, it looks like that is the only wire from the motor. The other contact, there, you see that there? It has a spring contact to touch the top power strip on the motor instead of having a soldered wire. I'll take the light bulbs out just so that I don't have to undo the wiring. Held down by those plastic clips. And they're just the two wires coming from the trucks. So those are the typical pull-off plastic caps. Now the PC board is out of there. So it looks like this does work using a frame-grounded system, very similar to how Athearn does it. So the trucks have the, for this rail, power goes through the frame, up the weight. I believe it's that screw there is what grounds the board to it before getting the power back to that top strip on the motor. So this is not a DCC ready isolated system exactly. If you're installing DCC, you have to get rid of the old PC board entirely. In a lot of cases, even the light bulbs too, unless you want to add a resistor to them, because they are 1.5 volt bulbs. Getting the weight out, there's those two screws. That's interesting. Normally these are just a single piece cast weight on these older Proto 2000s. One more in the front. So on a lot of these older models, the fuel tank is held in place by a strip of double stick tape. Just stick that back in there a little. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So there are the two other screws for the weight. And these are flat blade. Ah, one more screw in back. There it goes. So this weight really does fit tightly around all the components to fill as much space as possible. That's nicely done. Now you can see that Athearn clone motor more closely. The commutators on these are a little smaller than on Athearn's, and the brush holders come down further. So that's one of the major visual differences, aside from this being silver instead of gold. You've got your brass flywheels. This actually still feels like it's turning pretty freely for the most part, so it might just need a little fresh oil. As I turn this though, I do feel some catching in there, so I'm thinking this does have at least one split axle gear. And since this is the Athearn clone chassis, those can be swapped out very easily with Athearn gears and work perfectly smooth. And of course, getting it apart is exactly the same as if you were working on an Athearn. Undo that, lift out the worm, and drop the truck out from the chassis. Actually, the oil and grease in here looks completely fresh. I don't think I'll have to redo that at all. The last new old stock Proto 2000 I worked on, the grease had turned to paste inside of it. It could barely even move itself. So this must have used a different grade. It's not quite wanting to come out. This might be easier if I pull the side frames off first. And the other one. Okay. Now let's have a closer look here. This one appears to be fine. This one. Also looks fine. Yeah, that is turning completely freely, completely smoothly. So for once, I don't have to clean out and re-grease one of these things. Yep, that is a completely smooth roller. So putting this plate back on, fits over the rivets there, as well as those two pins. Press the side frame back on. And that's ready to go back in. Yep, still feel some seizing in there, so check the other truck. Ah, there it is. So this is the cracked axle gear, so I will go and get an Athearn gear to replace that. As for this gear, it seems to be perfectly fine. Well, actually no, I see a crack in that one too, so I'll replace both of these. It's always a good idea to keep a stock of Athearn gears on hand when you're running a lot of these Proto 2000s. Just pull that out of there and stick it into the new one. Check that with a gauge. Looks like I got it just right. There we go, that works nice and smooth. There's still enough grease in those gears. I don't think I even need to add any to these. It's a tight fit and left some nice markings in my fingers. Those will go away after a couple minutes. Yep, everything works perfect. Yep, no more hanging, so that is ready to run. So that's how you work on one of these old Proto 2000 chassis. Once you've got the weight off, it's exactly like taking an Athearn apart. I was curious about why this is a separate weight and realized that on some versions of the GP20, the number boards might be down here instead, so that would allow them to run the light bulb down to this area instead of keeping it on top. Alright, now that is all back together and ready to run. And I would like to just make a quick comment about their electronics decisions. Honestly, until about the mid-2000s, Proto electronics were not really that good, in my opinion. Like, this is probably one of their earliest directional constant lighting boards, and I mean, it's already obvious that you just throw the whole thing out to replace it for DCC, which is perfectly fine, but after this, they came up with an odd kind of DCC 8-pin quick plug design where they had the same constant lighting board basically screwed down to the chassis just like this, but then everything is wired to an 8-pin plug that went down on top of it, and when you wanted to install DCC, you would pull off that board, or the plug, you would take out the board, throw that away, and then you would plug in your decoder to the, well, you would connect your decoder to that sort of quick plug, but at the same time you would have to either add resistors to the light bulbs or replace them. So even though it had a DCC ready quick plug, it was not actually that DCC ready. And they used basically the same system on some LED lighting not too long after that, sometime in the mid-2000s. I'd say that that was probably the worst of their electronic designs overall, because again, just kind of a useless or needlessly complicated system that people just shouldn't have had to deal with. They could have come up with a much simpler way to do it. Anyway, let's get the shell over here and put this together. All right, so there's the shell. And on a lot of Proto 2000 models, you have to take off the coupler boxes first, slip the shell on, screw it down before putting the coupler boxes back in. But in this one, they made it so that it's just a simple snap-on design so that you can get it onto the track and running as quickly as possible. So just gently go around, snapping it down a little at a time, all while being careful not to damage any of the fragile plastic details around. There, and that all seems to be in place now. And for getting the shell back off at a later time, you can find the latches for it around certain areas there, so you can pry those back while pushing the shell up and off or pulling it off. And I believe a couple more of the latches may be underneath the fuel tank, which, like you saw before, is double taped in place and simply pulls off. So there's the basic assembly of the model. But like I also showed before, it includes a whole bag of detail parts to get it looking that much better. First of all, we've got these horn hook couplers, which are not going to be used, and I suspect that most people buying these models never used them. You got your door opener, you got the steps for the pilots, and I'll have to read up on what all these parts are where they go. This looks like an electrical outlet maybe goes somewhere. Probably underneath. Hopefully they show all that in the instructions. And there are some sunshades here. And it appears that these need to be glued on, which is the same case for a lot of these parts, I would expect. Yeah, it looks like there are a lot of different electrical boxes that you can choose from that go all around. Then you've got your winterization hatch right here. I don't believe the EMD demonstrator ever had these installed, at least not that I've seen in photos. But this should go, I believe this goes right over here. So it would cover that radiator fan, that smaller radiator fan. It's got a few locator tabs, and to install this you would have to drill some holes into the shell. Now, I didn't look inside beforehand, but if it's like my Proto 2000 SD60, there will be some drilling locator holes inside the shell so that you can go in there with a small handheld drill and just poke those holes out and get things installed. So after checking through prototype photos, looks like the only parts I'll be adding are two of these, the sunshades, the pilots, and the rest I will not be using. So we'll start with these electrical boxes. There are, like I mentioned before, pilot holes underneath that allow you to drill through. So I just need to do that real carefully. I've got a number 75 bit right here. There it goes. Make sure that is clean. It looks like that drill bit was actually a tiny bit too small. Get a larger one and clean that out a little more. Let's try number 71. There, that time it went in. As for these front pilot details, these you don't glue on. Instead, you just kind of get them up underneath the MU hoses. Bend things upward a little, keep them straight. Those insert into the slots. And those tabs insert into the front pilot. And the MU hoses keep them in place just from some pressure. So just notice that this can kind of rotate on top of there. Seems like it's just a kind of a loose press fit. Well, if that becomes a problem, it can be glued on. Then the other details to be added on are the sunshades here. Just gently hold that. Just get a touch of glue on there. Not much. Then fit that over that windowsill. Just hold that in place carefully until the glue holds. And there it is. And that is now fully assembled and ready to run. So let's get this back over to the layout. Alright, now I think we can get on to looking at some of the details of the assembled model. And there is a lot. So, starting with the top, you've got these see-through radiator fans with the fans inside, and these are all molded in color, the housings and the fans themselves. So it's not painted silver like the rest of the body, but they did manage to get the silver color of the plastic pretty close, so most of the time it looks pretty good there. It's just when you really look up close that you can see the difference between the two. Also along the top are plastic lift rings that are all individually applied. Again, molded in color, but they are finely molded. They look really good overall. You can see the small holes going through the center, so they're not filled in with flash or anything like I've seen on some other plastic parts. There's also the bell here, again, molded in color. And this is just on one single small mounting point, so you can see it has some flex to it. So I would say that that's a fragile part and you should be careful handling around that area. But since it is flexible, it should at least hold up pretty well as long as you don't handle it too much. Then around the sides, you've got these see-through grills that are applied, and once again, molded in color, but pretty close match to the paint. And underneath that, it's not see-through all the way through the body, but you can see some additional ventilation detail which helps to improve the overall three-dimensional appearance, which is very nice. And then of course there's also those sunshades which I applied earlier from the detail kit. Then the windows on the sides of the cab, these have their frames painted silver. You've got grab irons on both the front and back. All of these are plastic parts, so again, a bit fragile, but durable enough that they can stand up to some handling. And they're molded in both silver and dark blue to match the paint. Along the walkway, you've got full molded in tread detail, which looks very good. And then going down the steps, these are all see-through parts, molded in color with a good see-through effect. Once again, no filling with flash. Now, one of the notable details on here, I'd say, is the handrails. You'll notice that they are completely straight from front to back. There's no perceptible warping. And that's a problem that I've seen even on models more expensive than this one, from Athearn Genesis, even Atlas, where they didn't account quite correctly for the different plastic material that these are compared to the shell. And because of that, they end up shrinking a little more than the plastic that's made for the shell. And as a result, the stanchions will often be warped inward like that, and also create some little wavy sections of the railing itself. So it's really nice to see that they got these straight and accounted correctly for shrinkage. Fuel tank is also well detailed with a couple separate parts, some piping and air tanks. All of this is painted, no molded in color parts, so that looks very good. The trucks are also well detailed with a few separate parts, such as the air tanks, as well as this part down here, which I can't remember what it's called, but it's involved with that central spring. And then around to the pilots, you've got those steps which I installed earlier, which also have see-through detailing and look great. Although, once again, molded in color, so not a perfect match to the paint, but good enough from most viewing angles. We've got the separately applied MU hoses, as well as the coupler lift bar. And then the couplers themselves are the plastic Proto 2000, which are both copies of KD couplers at the centering spring area, and then the cheaper McHenry couplers at the knuckle spring, which is just a molded bit of plastic, which will definitely weaken over time. So these couplers are definitely ones that you want to replace with some good KD couplers. Newer models will have the all-metal Proto Max couplers. Now, one of the details that I mentioned earlier on this model is the opening doors. So the way that you open that up, you take this little wire hook piece, place it underneath just a small opening that's in the door, angle it up a bit, and you can start to pull back on the door and open it up. And then you can kind of gently open it the rest of the way by hand. So that looks like the engine is parked, or just has the crew walking in and out. You can also do that with the door on the other side, so that's a really cool feature. Something I wish that they'd still do with their newer models, but at the same time it's understandable that they'd stop because it's just extra complexity, which will be ignored by most people. Close the door, just give it a little push, and it stays in place. And then one more movable detail is the steps at the front and back of the engine. These just pull out and fold down. So that's another nice little detail that they put on there, which usually is just molded in as part of the railings. Now, the paint quality is excellent all around with very few imperfections. There are only a couple small spots that I can see where the paint isn't quite perfect, like a couple edges of the cab, front and back, which you can see there on the roof. And then the paint separation, it's mostly good and sharp all around. There are just a couple areas, like especially around the sort of, you could call it the lightning separation here, or the lightning line, where it's just a little fuzzy around the doors. There are also just a couple spots of minor imperfection where small bits of dust got underneath the paint, but for the most part these are not at all visible. Then the lettering itself is printed very sharply all around. It's very bold, opaque, consistent, with a nice white color. The only issue with it at all is that it's quite a bit shinier than the paint used around the rest of the body. And then for these GP20 logos on the nose, when you look up close, you'll notice that the silver didn't quite fill in some of the details underneath, but for the most part, that's really not visible at all, and you'll almost never see it aside from close inspection or even magnification. The directional headlights work well, and they are visible once turned on. They're not the brightest though, so if you're replacing the standard board with a DCC decoder, you might also want to consider replacing the lights with some good bright LEDs to really shine through those lenses as well as the number boards. Honestly, the only thing I would consider to be negative at all to the detailing on here would be the cab interior. The box says that this has a fully detailed interior, but in reality, all it is a crew that's molded into their seats, and there's nothing else beyond that, and they are just in their regular black plastic color, so you can't even see them. So if you want to see the crew at all, they have to be removed and painted by hand. Now let's get on to the running quality of the model. I've already given this some break-in time just so that it's running as well as possible. Although out of the box it ran really just about as well as it already does. One little thing that I've noticed is that there's a little bit of a warm-up period when it's been powered off for a while. But once you've had it running for about 5 minutes, it can get up to its full speed. Takes off nice and smoothly. It's pretty quiet. There is just a small amount of gear noise, which is noticeable. Not too loud, but noticeable. I thought maybe that had come from the Athearn gears that I installed, but after swapping some of the axles around, I found that it just seems to be the gearing of the trucks themselves. So, not perfect silence, but still nice and quiet, and very smooth running. 12 volts, once the model's warmed up, it hits about 65 scale miles per hour. And because of the voltage drop of the lighting circuit, it would actually be able to hit maybe closer to 85 scale miles per hour without it. As the model's running around, there is no perceptible wobble at all from it, so those are some excellent quality wheels that they put on there. Low speed control is also decent. I've measured about 5 scale miles per hour for a consistent low speed. So not quite the best on the market, but definitely acceptable for a good quality model. It also has no trouble at all going over switches. So I'll just back that up here. Get the switches activated. Now let's take that back around. And as bumpy as my switches are, it barely even flinches. Coming back around at full speed, no problem at all. In all the break-in time that this model had, it didn't get a single derailment. So yeah, this just has really excellent tracking in both directions. No derailments. So I think whatever layout this is on, it's going to be a very reliable runner. You're not going to have many issues with these at all. Now, thanks to the all-metal chassis, that huge weight as well as the flywheels, the model weighs in at 14.7 ounces. So that's definitely a good amount of weight for a model this size and should translate to some very good pulling power. Now, on Model Railroader's various reviews over the years, going all the way up to the most recent Walther's version, they've tested the pulling power to be about good enough for 20 freight cars, maybe a little more. Let's put that to the test and see what it can actually pull. Alright, so to start off, I've got this loaded with 20 free-rolling freight cars. So let's see what happens. Takes right off, not even a sign of slipping. So I guess I'll keep on loading it with cars, and either I'll run out of track or we'll finally see how much this can pull. Well, I've gotten this all the way up to 31 freight cars and I'm out of track. And it still has no problem at all. Takes right off, and even if I stop it and then push it to just a real sudden hard start, not even a slip. So this really has plenty of pulling power for even a completely unrealistic number of freight cars for an engine of this size. There are going to be no problems pulling a realistic load, even up a grade. So overall, the lifelike Proto 2000 GP20 is an excellent model all around. You get a well-detailed shell with detail parts everywhere you look that are well applied with no visible glue marks. You get great quality paint with good separation between the colors. The paint colors are nice and bold with really no transparency that you can see anywhere. The details are sharply molded, nice and clean, and look great. And the additional user-applied details are also a nice touch. You get a great quality chassis with a heavy metal frame, a large superweight, and then Athearn clone parts, which means that it's easy to replace pretty much anything that may have failed, such as cracked gears, to keep these things going for a long time to come. It's rock solid, dependable, powerful, and has no problems pulling a realistic load behind it. The electronics, of course, aren't the best, but those can be easily swapped out when adding DCC, as well as the lights, which are a little dim, can be swapped out with some better LEDs. And the plastic couplers can be easily changed out for some better quality Kadee couplers. Really, the only complaints I have are minor ones, such as the unpainted crew, which is pretty much invisible, but those can be pulled out and painted by hand to get them looking a little better. And then I'd say too many of the large detail parts should have been painted instead of molded in color, but the molded color is at least close enough to the paint to look good at most viewing angles. Now, as for the value of this model, I bought this brand new in the box, which you saw before, and before tax and shipping, it was only $75. You could easily find one in used condition, but still in very good condition for even cheaper than that. And for an HO scale GP20, I really don't think you can do better. So this is just an absolute top quality model for a great value. So if you're interested in getting an HO scale GP20 and you see one of these come along, I would definitely recommend getting it because you won't be disappointed at all.